It's been in a state of near-perpetual war for decades. It receives billions of dollars a year in aid and weapons, and it has consistently broken international law by expanding its occupation and settlements. Is Israel a normal state? How does it compare to failed states? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. Israel is a relatively young state and one of the most troubled, fighting several wars with neighboring states since its creation in 1948. It has one of the world's best equipped armies, thanks to billions of dollars in U.S. military and financial aid each year. The current coalition government is the most right-wing in Israel's history. And before this Gaza war, mass protests were taking place for months against the government's efforts to weaken the Supreme Court's powers. Israel has ignored international law and United Nations resolutions on the treatment of Palestinians and the occupation of Palestinian land. Governments and international rights organizations accuse its military of war crimes in the brutal offensive that we're seeing in Gaza. For its leader, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, a view often repeated by supporters. But for critics, Israel is a political entity that can only survive with repression, the denial of rights, and violence. So is Israel a normal state? Could it be defined as a fragile state? Or does it have characteristics of a failed state? We'll be putting those questions and more to our guests in a few moments. First, though, this report from Katia Lopez-Horayan.
Israel is under pressure, with protesters demanding Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu bring home the captives Hamas is still holding in Gaza. Netanyahu is often referred to as Mr. Security, but critics, including former military officers, say he and his right-wing coalition have failed the country. Too many social and political fragilities, they say, have been exposed, and the war could magnify them.
It's derailing out of control as it continues to snowball and more death amasses and the cycle of death continues. I don't think it's bringing security now, and I don't think it'll bring security for the future. I think it'll do the contrary. It'll be the opposite.
Relentless attacks on Gaza and the growing toll of Palestinian casualties have led to other concerns, from the judicial system where Palestinians can be imprisoned indefinitely without charge to the inequality faced by Israel's minority groups. Other issues, such as the expansion of Israeli settlements illegal under international law and the distribution of assault rifles to Israeli civilians in the occupied West Bank, have also raised alarm. The Prime Minister says political rivals are using the war to fuel baseless criticism.
We have a desire to avoid harming the population. We have a very strong desire to hurt Hamas.
But long before October the 7th, tensions were already brewing, with some of the largest demonstrations in Israel's history. Netanyahu's push to curb the powers of the Supreme Court led to widespread condemnation at home and abroad. Critics accuse the right-wing government of false advertising by presenting Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. Now its war on Gaza has opened up another front. There is a sense the country is in a perpetual state of war. Israel is trying to keep its allies close, but as the horrors of Gaza unfold daily, more around the world will be asking if Israel can function without being at war. Katia Lopez-Horayan for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. In Chicago, we are joined by Ali Abunimah, the co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, an independent online news publication focusing on Palestine. In Washington, D.C. is Paul Turner, the president and executive director of the Fund for Peace. That's a nonprofit research organization that produces the annual Fragile States Index, or FSI. We'll be talking about that in a moment. And in Haifa is Ilan Pappe, Israeli historian, author of The Idea of Israel, A History of Power and Knowledge. A warm welcome to you all. Ali, let's go to you first. 1 year after Operation Cast Lead, that was the 2008 war in Gaza, you wrote an article entitled, Israel Resembles a Failed State. And that assessment was based partly on the destruction that you saw in Gaza, on Israel's standing in the international community, as well as other factors. If you had to complete or rewrite that article today, 14 years on, what would be your assessment?
Sadly, it would be the same. What I wrote in 2008 or 2009 and again in 2014 is Israel is a so-called state that was founded on expulsion, ethnic cleansing, and what historian Ilan Pappe has called incremental genocide. And what we predicted over the years is that this incremental genocide could become a very rapid genocide, and that's what we have seen since October 7th, a genocide that is being fueled by lies, by demonization of the Palestinian people, by dehumanization, and I think that a state that can only exist by oppressing, expelling, dispossessing, and ultimately exterminating the indigenous people of the territory it exists on.
Paul Turner, President and Executive Director of the Fund for Peace, a nonprofit research organization that produces the annual Fragile States Index. As I said in the opener, I want to talk about that index because you rate Israel and you rate separately Palestine on this fragility gradient. Explain to us how it works. I mean, briefly, your methodology is that you look at a number of quantitative, qualitative factors, the politics of a country, the economics of a country, the society of a country. So we can put that up on screen because you do share that with people who go on your website. And then you give all these countries a grade and you put them in buckets from sustainable to, at the low end of the scale, failed state, essentially. Where does Israel stand?
I think Israel is facing a really challenging situation in that it has both external and internal pressures. A lot of countries that are out there obviously will experience one or the other. Those internal pressures have been escalating recently for reasons that you've already shared in the broadcast. However, I think it currently is far from a failed state. When we think about failed states, a lot of times those, for example, in the security sector, they talk about how they no longer have a monopoly on the use of force within their borders. At the Fund for Peace, as you referenced, we tend to believe it's more meaningful to talk about terms of state fragility than state failure necessarily, because every country in the world has pockets of fragility. And that fragility exists on a spectrum or a continuum where countries have very high social, economic, political, and security stresses, and some have less. And Israel is experiencing a combination. Countries at the top of our Fragile States Index, for example, like Somalia and Afghanistan, have difficulty governing across their territory. They typically have porous borders, often armed groups operating within their borders, and experience major societal divisions. Fragile states typically experience protracted, recurrent humanitarian crises with high levels of sustained human suffering. So as you hear some of those descriptors of a failed state, you can tell that Israel really has quite a ways to go before it gets there, which is a good thing, but it's also experiencing those incredible stressors, and it needs to be proactive in dealing with those instead of letting them fester and exacerbate.
So I noticed actually looking at your index. So to be clear, Israel rates pretty highly. It rates pretty well in that index. It's near where the United States is. It's in the 140 range, and you measure about 179 countries, if I'm not mistaken. But a while back, you used to measure Israel and the occupied West Bank, and you would get to a very different grade, overall grade. Whereas I've noticed now over the last, I think it's 3 years, you measure Israel and Palestine you measure them separately, such that Israel gets essentially a good grade. You assess it to be a stable country, and Palestine a low grade on the fragility index. Why did you disassociate the two, bearing in mind that Palestine is the Palestinian territories, the occupied West Bank is, well, occupied by Israel?
Great question. So with all things, we do our best to let data drive us. We strive to be nonpartisan and not show favoritism and let the information lead where it may. So as a lot of different data sets begin to to provide information both on Israel and on Palestine, we followed suit. We work by pulling in thousands of different data points, both from existing indices as well as from kind of tools that are designed to go out and look at what's on the internet and bring that forward, and then work with experts to qualitatively assess that. So as new information became available that allowed us to separate the two, that's why that happened. There wasn't anything else behind it other than that.
Sure, but it does present a very different picture when you look at them together, and they are inextricably linked.
Certainly, and I think it might be a little bit naive, given the interdependence within the region, to only look at those two, because I think that you'll see the activities taking place today in Israel and Palestine are having a huge impact across the region. And so to be able to justifiably separate, any attempts to understand what's going on by only looking at one place or another, I think does it a real disservice.
Ali, I see you frowning. I'll give you a chance to address that in a moment, but I want to turn to Ilan. Ilan, when I look at the FSI, the fragility index, it goes from essentially failed to sustainable. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but looking at the long arc of your work, I think it's fair to say you argue pretty powerfully that Israel in its current construct, with its current policies, within its current borders, and with its current administration, not just of Israel, but the occupation of Palestinian territories, that trajectory is not sustainable. Is that fair?
I think it's a fair assessment, because I think Israel is not just a state. Israel is a project. It's a settler colonial project. And I do think that we are witnessing the beginning of the end of this project, because it rests on three pillars. One is material, of course, and there I agree. I mean, when you use an index that looks at sustainability of state according to their material capability, Israel is doing well. And as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, it does well mainly because of the United States. So this is a condition that can change. The second pillar is the social coherence of the settler society. And we know that this coherence is non-existent anymore. There is a bit of an optic illusion because of the Hamas operation on the 7th of October that created a sense of unity, but it's not going to cover up for the fragmentation of the society that we have seen until the 7th of October. It seems that coherence that is based, or social coherence, that is based on hatred of the Arabs or the Palestinians, and doesn't have very much anything else in common, is not very sustainable. And more importantly than anything else, of course, there is the legitimacy pillar. And Israel enjoys the legitimacy of Western governments or governments in the global north, and therefore there is a sense that it can still be sustainable because of that support of the elites. But it has lost the support of the civil societies. And this is why probably it's the only state in the world that lobbies for its existence, not for its policies, not for its better economic performance, but for its very moral justification, and it's losing that battle. Just a caveat, as an historian, I can tell you that when projects like settler colonialism are reaching their last phase, unfortunately, this can be quite a long period. It doesn't happen in 1 day or 2 days. And the problem is, of course, that they become more brutal and ruthless in that last phase, which is, on the one hand, very bad news for those who are the victims of this state, or have been always the victims of this state, which are the Palestinians. But it also means that the Palestinians can and have to get their act together, because I do think there will be a vacuum once this settler colonial project disintegrates, and there will be something else coming instead of it, which, of course, we all hope, at least I hope, that the Palestinian liberation movement would lead us into a better future when this will happen.
Ali, what did you want to say earlier?
Yeah, I mean, you saw me making a face. It's because I find this kind of very dry, very technical, pseudo academic discourse of these indexes as if you can measure these things with numbers and it all looks very objective. I just find it very unconvincing. And I find it unconvincing, and this is not anything personal about your other guest, it's a comment on the structure of how these indexes are produced. But when I look at the website of the Fund for Peace, this organization, it's funded by the British government, the Australian government, the Dutch government, by NATO, by Chevron, by a major oil company, among others. And so these are not parties that are going to produce research that casts Israel in a true light. To talk about Israel as a stable country when it has murdered more than 7,000 children in the past 60 days, to talk about Israel as a stable country when it has attacked and destroyed hospitals, when it destroyed, in the last few days, the Palace of Justice in Gaza, destroying the court records and the legal records for hundreds of thousands of people. This is not a country or a state by any normal definition. And to talk about it in that way is utterly obscene and shows a complete disconnection from reality. Look at the pictures on the screen now. This is not what normal countries do. And to separate the West Bank and Gaza from Israel is another fiction. To pretend you can carve off Israel as some kind of normal, stable country, and the West Bank and Gaza to even... There's no Palestinian state. To call Palestine a state is false. It's like calling the Warsaw Ghetto a state. This is a killing field, and it's utterly obscene to distract attention away from that. Ilan is correct. This is a settler colonial project, and it's one that has only ever been able to exist through massacring Palestinians, starting from the 1930s with the bombings that the Zionists carried out in marketplaces in Palestine, to the massacres of Deir Yassin and Tantura and Qibya and Sabra and Shatila, to today. Normal countries don't exist on the basis that Israel exists, of massacre after massacre after massacre. Israel is not a state, it is a criminal enterprise.
Paul, I assume you probably want to write a response to some of what Ali was saying about the FSI, the fragility index that you put together.
Sure, I can just share briefly that we actually haven't had any funding in the development of the Fragile States Index for many years, so that's all done in-house. And we haven't ever had a donor come in and tell us how we are to use or to manipulate data. That's not something that we would stand for and goes against our operating principles. I think that there's a little bit of internal dissonance or friction in terms of our conversation. There are a number of countries, including my own, that are fairly stable, but are also involved in acts that go against some of the international norms and even arguably the rule of law. We were involved in two conflicts for almost 20 years and have active operations taking place around the world that didn't necessarily destabilize us as a country, other than having some economic impacts. So I think that may be something that is worth really trying to parse out issues of stability versus whether or not we see approval in the way that a country conducts its business, and whether or not there is human suffering that's taking place.
That's a question I was actually wanted to ask you, is about this sustainability. Since you measure countries, the FSI measures countries, right, from being a quasi-failed state to being sustainable. And I would point out that your report was put together, I believe, before the Gaza war. It may look a little different now. I don't know how you would update it. In fact, that's the heart of my question. Is this, what we're seeing, sustainable if you factor in what's happened in the last 2 months?
That's a great question. I think that when you look at Israel and what is causing some of the issues of its fragility, we see concerns in two different places. One is in the area of group grievance and kind of the internal divisions that are taking place, and the other is around the factionalization of the elites. Whether or not what's taken place the last 2 months is sustainable, we don't have a crystal ball, nor does anyone else. I think as we look out to the future, we could anticipate fairly significant drops in its fragility. In other words, it's becoming increasingly fragile. And I think that the data will certainly reinforce that. We also have a tool called a crisis sensitivity simulator, where you're able to take the historical data and introduce low, medium, or high level shocks to a country and see what happens. And then when we do this with Israel, we see that it does have a protracted effect over time. And I think we could anticipate a multi-year effort to recover from the shocks that this is creating, both internal and externally.
Okay, let me take that to Ilan. So Paul was talking about Israel will be increasingly fragile as a result of this conflict, what we've seen over the last 2 months. It's possible that future reports will reflect this. You told us a few minutes ago that you think this is the beginning. This marks the beginning of the end of Israel's settler project. I was wondering, what makes you believe that? Do you see concrete signs of that, or is that more of a general perception?
No, it's not a general perception. I can see very concrete evidence for this. The debate that was more than a debate. It was almost like a cold civil war that did not at all concern the Palestinians. It was an internal Jewish debate between, you can call it the secular state of Israel and the theocratic fundamentalist state of Judea, namely the state that grew in the occupied territories in the settlements. You could clearly see that the idea of a Jewish state translated into an ethnic, racist theocracy is winning over the idea, which would anyway, to my mind, was never going to be realistic, of having the same occupation and colonization alongside a pluralist liberal society. So between these two options, the options of a fundamentalist, non-democratic, some would say even fascist, Jewish state, and I'm not yet talking even about the Palestinians, is winning support among large sections of the Israeli Jewish society. And that means that internally, there is hardly any cohesion to keep the society together. And economically, the people are holding Israel together from an economic perspective, namely the economic elite of Israel belongs to the secular, so-called liberal Israelis. And they were about to take out the money out of Israel before the 7th of October. Many of them talked about relocation or immigration. The events in the last 2 months gives the impression as if this is all behind us, but it's not. This will return. And of course, I would join Ali in saying that apart from all of this, the colonization and occupation of millions of Palestinians through state apparatus that involved hundreds of thousands of people to maintain it is not, as an historian, I'm sure this cannot be upheld forever. And this is not just because of the Palestinian resistance, but it's also because of processes that we see taking place in the neighboring Arab states, in the Muslim world, in the global South, and in the large sections of the civil society in the global North. All of it doesn't bode well for the Zionist project, because it seems to be going against history. If you think about it, history is now moving towards decolonization, to the end of colonial projects, the end of settler colonial project, and Israel is moving into enhancing the settler colonial project. There are so many groups in the world that see that their own struggle for justice is combined with the struggle of Palestine for justice. Yes, it has not yet influenced the governments, but it has the potential to do this. You know, you can look at it differently. There is a huge movement of solidarity with the Palestinian called the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. The boycott and divestment is working. The sanction has not happened yet, but you can see the movement, the potential movement from the B and D, if you want, the boycott and divestment into the sanction, exactly as happened in the case of apartheid South Africa. That's why I'm saying in this story, we see all these indications that this is about to change. Unfortunately, as happened in apartheid South Africa, this is a moment, a very dangerous moment also for the Palestinian people, because these regimes always fight for their life with the most ruthless and most powerful lethal weapons, as we can see unfolding in front of our eyes in the Gaza Strip today.
Just briefly, Ali, I'd like to bring you back in, and this is probably going to be the last answer. As somebody who's advocated for one binational states with equal rights for all, do you agree with that assessment that we might be right now witnessing the beginning of the end of Israel's current political project?
Yeah, I just want to be clear. I didn't mean to suggest regarding the Fund for Peace that any of these funders were coming in and directly manipulating the data. Of course not. I just meant to say that an organization like that knows that if they're producing information truthful and critical about Israel, the funding from the Pentagon, the State Department, and the Defense Intelligence Agency, which the Fund for Peace also receives according to its website, would pretty quickly stop. But yes, we are seeing the end of this colonial project. It's a bloody end. It's much bloodier than South Africa.
Briefly,
because
please.
At the end of the day, the South Africans said, we can't sustain the level of violence it will take to keep our white supremacist settler colony alive, and they went into negotiations to peacefully end apartheid. Israel needs to be brought to that point through maximum international pressure, and a state that commits genocide, as Israel is doing right now as we speak, has to be brought to a peaceful conclusion and replaced with true democracy, equality, restitution, and decolonization. There is no future for this genocidal entity in Palestine or the region, and it has to be brought to a peaceful end.
Ali Abunimah, Paul Turner, Ilan Pappe, thank you very much to all of you for joining us, and thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That is facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Cyril Vanier, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.